Good evening and welcome to our weekly book study here at New Covenant House. As you know, we are studying Christianopoulos, Christian Anarchism. He wrote it as his doctoral thesis. And we are in part 2 of the book, chapter 4 and 5 to be precise. And we will remember that in part 1, the first part was a manifesto for Christian anarchism, the Sermon on the Mount. And the second part was other places in the Bible where anarchism is showing. And the third part was Christian anarchist writers' critique of the state. The state is violent, deceptive, and exploitative, they say. And now we are in part 2, chapter 4, which is an attempt to discern how Christian anarchists should respond to the state. And there are 5 sections to that. First of all, there is Romans 13, which we're going to be dealing with tonight. And then number 2, there is the payment of taxes. Number 3, there is the issue of nonviolence. And the 4th is let's see. How the anarchists respond to things like elections, service in office, and taxes, and military service, and that sort of things. And then finally, number 5, the Christian Revolution, which is a revolution of sacrifice and forgiveness. Living Christ's teaching as example of Christ's teaching, living that out in real life. So tonight we are talking about Romans 13. And there are some different views on how to look at that. The conventional view is that Paul, who's the writer of Romans 13, is an attempt to legitimize the church's support of the state, and that it is sanctified by God and welcome, and Christians should welcome and collaborate with the state. There are several problems with that. Number 1 is that the church has frequently throughout history supported tyrants, and when you buy into that, then you are indirectly also supporting tyrants, and Christian anarchists would not willingly do that. Christian anarchists kind of reject that interpretation and offer an alternative. But first, let's take a little look at Paul himself, because some of the writers are also suspicious of Paul. In other literature, we can see that Paul is seen as a self-appointed apostle. He never knew Jesus. He is altogether a suspect, and also some of the writings may not have been written by him at all. They're written by other people. So with that, they're saying that he's confusing Jesus' message, or at worst betraying it. There's writers like Tolstoy, Hennessy, and Eliot who do that. And one of the reasons why Paul might have written something like that would be that he did not expect this current state to last long. He expected Christ to return imminently, and there was really no reason to fight the state on that. So that's why, there may have been one reason why he wrote what he wrote. But anyway, so The other anarchist writers say that for Christians there is no need for a law because we have Jesus' commandment to love one another, and laws are simply not a way to exercise justice. So let's dig into it. There's the first. They call this chapter is called the Christian Anarchist Exegesis Subversive Subjection. And one of the first writers that I mentioned is Redford. He has this theory that Paul is using a literary technique called classic ironic technique of blaming by apparent praise. I think it sounds like Christianopoulos is kind of dismissive of that idea because he says it's a justification to brush aside the text and patient attempts to grapple with it and give it a real chance. So we're going to skip over that pretty quickly. But it did remind me of an episode where Trump has given a State of the Union address, and Speaker Pelosi got up and applauded him. But she did it in a way that made it clear that she did not agree with what he had been saying. So the news media the next day called it a sarcastic applause. And I think that's sort of what Redford is looking at here. Yeah, so and that is Redford and Carter. They also point out that at this point in history, the Christians in Rome were persecuted. And not only there, but everywhere else, as a matter of fact. But there was really Paul himself is not in Rome himself at this. He's just writing a letter to the Christians in Rome. So he's telling them that there's no reason to upset the bear. So to just tough it out, so to speak. Keep good relations with them, so because Jesus is going to come back and it'll be all good soon anyway. Now I think we're going to get into a more pervasive exegesis of the passage. Yoder is a representative of that view, and I don't think he's the only one who's saying this. He says that chapters 12 and 13 in Romans are really one unit, and there's a progression from friend to stranger and then to enemies, which implies that Paul is teaching us that we should love our enemies, just like Jesus did in the Sermon on the Mount. And that's the purpose of the text that he has given us. Yeah. And there's a lot to say about that, and I'm going to kind of pick and choose a little bit because this would take a long time to go through every little detail. But I think the gist of the whole idea is that we are supposed to obey God, not the state. Our allegiance is to God, not the state, it says. And I'm not sure who says it, but somebody does, that draws a parallel back to 1 Samuel chapter 8, in which the Israelites has asked Samuel to ask for a god, for a king, just like the other nations have it. And God, through Samuel, replies that this is a terrible idea, you should not do it, there's all kinds of bad things are going to happen if you do. But the Israelites resisted. And but God gave them a king anyway. And the idea, I think, is that, and that's what the book says, I think, is that this is God's way of kind of keeping the rebellious Israelites a little bit in check. He's uses the state as one of his servants, in quotes, servants in quotes, in his mysterious ordering of the cosmos. So it's a way for him to kind of like keep an eye on things, even though the Israelites had kind of rejected him. Yeah. So, I think this is Yoder speaking. He said, God is not said to create or institute or ordain the powers that be, but only to order them. And so that means that the state that God has kind of like allowed the pagans to have is just for the pagans. It is not for the Christians. We are supposed to follow Christ, not the king. Yeah, it goes on a little bit more about that. I think one important lesson is that we are not supposed to overthrow Caesar. And Caesar is kind of like a synonym for all powers, really, everywhere and every time. He's telling the Christians in Rome to stay away from any notion of insubordination and instead to adopt a loving, non-resistant attitude towards a tyrannical government. So that is a kind of like an underground subversion to the state, making them believe that they have you under control while you're really not. And it's an attempt to legitimize the state, but it also makes a point of not legitimizing any insurrection either. It is reminding Christians that Jesus refused to engage in that type of revolutionary politics. The Christian's revolution is to happen by setting an example of love, forgiveness, and sacrifice instead. You may remember from your reading of the Bible that Jesus on several occasions rejected the people's request to make him a king and to be a leader. Yeah, we kind of like, it said, the book uses the words indifference to be kind of like ignoring the state whenever we can, and submitting to it in a kind of in your face, not really in your face, but in a subversive way to allow it to rule over us. But only to a certain extent. What we are supposed to do is to follow Christ whenever there's a conflict between what the state does and what we're supposed to be doing. Yeah, we have to be careful not to become rulers ourselves. Yeah. So and there are a couple of other places in the Bible where this is being debated, and one of them is in 1 Peter, which pretty much says the same thing as Romans 13. Peter's allegiance is first and foremost, indeed only to God, and the respect he shows to the state is never absolute. So, like Paul, in many cases he had been disobedient to the state. So that is one of the reasons people say that Paul could not have possibly meant what he said in the text, that he asked for total submission to the state, because he himself disobeyed the state on several occasions, and sometimes even bragged about it. The other passage, other than Romans 13, is Revelation 13, where the beast is the enemy. And again, and in this case, we're not talking about Rome as the power, but we're talking about power in general, at all times and in all places. Archidom. Eller is the writer who talks about that. We are to submit to Archidom with patience and submission rather than violent revolution. Jesus calls for Christians to subvert it through love, sacrifice, and service. There is more to it, but we will leave that for another day and get back to it perhaps. But next week we're going to deal with Jesus' position on taxes, and there's a couple of passages there. One of them is the giving to Caesar passage, and the other one is where the temple tax comes out of the mouth of a fish. So we will deal with that next week, and I look forward to that. Thank you for coming, and good night.